about you, but it's hard for me to believe that the proceedings which resulted in the impeachment of President Trump, as well as his acquittal by the U.S. Senate, happened over 7 months ago. Good afternoon. I'm Jim Falk, President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, and I'm joined this afternoon by Jeffrey Toobin. You know him as the CNN senior legal analyst, as well as a staff writer at The New Yorker. His latest book, True Crimes and Misdemeanors, The Impeachment of Donald Trump, is a real-life legal thriller that draws out personalities and actually puts you as a fly on the wall descriptions behind some of the key decisions that shaped the Mueller investigation, the Ukraine story, as well as the impeachment and then the subsequent trial. But before we start our conversation, let me just remind you that you can purchase a copy of Jeff's book by going to interabangbooks.com. And if you do that, be sure to type in the code dfwworld to get that 10% off, not just on True Crimes and Misdemeanors, but for any books you have in your shopping cart. But that is only for online purchases. I want to especially thank our good supporters at the World Affairs Council, Susie and Jim Raleigh, for being sponsors of today's programs, as well as you, our members and audience who may have bought a ticket. We are very, very grateful. And special thanks to the World Affairs Councils of America, as well as the World Affairs Council or World Affairs San Francisco and the World Affairs Council of Orange County. If you'd like to keep up with our calendar at the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, please go to dfwworld.org. So, as I mentioned, Jeffrey Toobin is the senior legal analyst at CNN. He earned both his bachelor's in law degrees at Harvard, and he was also editor of the Law Review. From there, he became Assistant United States Attorney in Brooklyn, later working aside independent counsel Lawrence Walsh on the Iran-Contra affair. And from there, he turned to journalism, looking at major cases such as the O.J. Simpson trial, the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, which Jeff last brought you to Dallas and Fort Worth, as well as many others. His reporting on the Supreme Court is really exceptional, especially in the New Yorker, where he's written profiles on Justice Roberts, as well as many of the associate justices. And I have to say his book, although written over a decade ago, The Nine, the Inside the Secret World of the Supreme Court, is really just a fascinating examination of the Supreme Court and will really lead to a much better understanding of how the court operates. Jeff, great to see you. I wish you were in Santa Fe where I am, or that we were in Dallas.
Jim, I wish I was in Dallas. I mean, I love going to Dallas, and I can't speak for other authors, but for me, it's always a great privilege to go see people in person when I write a book. You know, writing a book is a very lonely business, and I'm always so flattered and pleased to see a nice big crowd of people who want to talk about my book, who want to get autographed copies. And look, you know, in the scheme of losses from this pandemic, it's a very, very small one, but it is something I regret not being able to do. But it is the world that we
we're living in right now. So before we really get into the book, I have to admit that I love listening to the Axe Files. And driving here to Santa Fe, I listened to your interview with David Axelrod. And I have to say, I didn't know the story about your mother. Both your parents were involved in journalism, and your mother was the ABC correspondent. Just tell us a little bit about her.
Well, my mother was really, she was a great mom, but she was also an extraordinary journalist and really a historic figure in television news. She joined ABC News in 1964 at a time when each network had literally one woman correspondent. There was one, you know, Pauline Frederick at CBS, Nancy Dickerson at NBC, and my mother, Marlene Sanders, at ABC. She had a 5-minute news show in the afternoon for 4 years. And during that period, she became the first network news correspondent woman to cover the Vietnam War. She was there for 6 weeks. It was an indelible experience in her life, something she was so glad to have done, as difficult as it was. I was 6 years old at the time. And she went on to be an executive at ABC, later became a correspondent at CBS News. And you know, I grew up in the news business. My dad was involved with public television. He was Bill Moyer's producer for many years. Then he was director of news for WNET, which is the public television affiliate in New York City. And I did go to law school and I did practice law for several years, but I sometimes think of my journalism career as coming into my genetic destiny. My parents—
They really steered you away from it.
Exactly. My parents, they understood, and I think they were right, that news in particular is a very mercurial business. There's no such thing as making partner in journalism. I mean, people do come and go. Law firms being partner is not what it used to be either, but that's a separate subject. But they were always worried about the instability of journalism, and sort of steered me away from it. But I think I saw how interesting their lives were, and how much engaged they were with what was going on in the world. I always did student journalism as a kid in high school and college. I started freelancing for magazines in law school. So I kind of had a foot in both worlds, but here I am.
It's worked out well.
27 years after I started working at the New Yorker. So I think I've pretty much locked in. This is where I'm going to spend my time.
So, all of us, or anybody who followed the news over the last 2-3 years, we certainly know what happened in a lot of the facts in your book, but you did such a nice job of pulling in new things, and you have such legitimacy in your reporting. One of the stories that President Trump continues to say is that Robert Mueller came into his office and essentially begged to be FBI director. And you open up with a different way to interpret what happened in the Oval Office. I wonder if we might start with that.
I mean, I think that's a polite way of saying that Trump has lied about what went on in that office for the entirety of Mueller's tenure as the special counsel. I opened with that scene because I thought it was a great tableau. I mean, here you have the only time that Donald Trump and Robert Mueller have ever met each other. It was May 16th, 2017, the week after Trump fired James Comey as FBI director, and Rod Rosenstein, who was the deputy attorney general at the time, he asked Mueller to give the president advice on who would make a good FBI director, because Mueller had been perceived as a success for 12 years. Now, just in terms of the facts surrounding what went on there, after J. Edgar Hoover died, Congress changed the law so that FBI directors had limited tenure. They could not serve more than 10 years because Congress didn't want anybody serving as long as Hoover did, which was more than 40 years. Congress, in an unusual move, unprecedented, extended Mueller's term for 2 years so that that he could continue serving under President Obama. But that was it. There was a limit, a legal limit on how long Mueller could serve. So even if Mueller wanted to be FBI director again, he couldn't possibly be, because he was barred by federal statute. So the idea that he was begging for his job back is just silly. I mean, it's impossible. But I think it's indicative of the president's attempt to try to portray Mueller as someone with an axe to grind against him. And the proximity of dates is really extraordinary, because that date was May 16th, 2017. It was the next day, May 17th, that Rosenstein asked Comey to be the FBI director, and that was, to be the special counsel investigating the 2016 campaign. So Trump was shocked to see him appointed, because he said, "Hey, that guy was just here," but he certainly wasn't begging for his job back.
So tell us a little bit about the research for this book. Who did you, you can tell us everybody you talked with, but was it on the record or off the record?
Well, this was, as you mentioned, I've written 8 books. This was by far the hardest book that I've written, just in terms of the logistics and the journalistic demands. In part, that was because, I agreed to write the book almost as soon as Mueller was appointed, but I quickly learned, as all journalists learned, that Mueller and his staff weren't talking to anybody. There were no leaks, there were no interviews, there was nothing coming out of that office. So I had to trust that I would get access to Mueller and to Mueller's team when he closed up shop. But of course, I didn't know when that would be. It turned out to be more than 2 years, and I did what I could following the investigation, writing New Yorker stories, covering it for CNN. But then, of course, much to my surprise, the Ukraine story arose, and that became an impeachment story. And one of the things I'm pleased about in the book is I integrate the two stories. And I think people have the mistaken impression that the Russia story and the Ukraine story are really separate. They're not. They're very much the same story. They're the same, many of the same cast of characters involved. The motivation of the president is much the same. And some of the misconduct is very similar. But again, I didn't know when the impeachment story was going to end. And obviously I wanted this book to come out before the election. And so I was sort of, flying by the seat of my pants, trying to report. Just to answer your question about reporting, I did the reporting in the same way that I've done, I think, all of my previous books, which is that all of my conversations with sources are on what's called background, which means I could use the information, but I couldn't identify the source. That way, it doesn't read like a newspaper or magazine article with, lots of, according to an informed source. It all just becomes a single narrative. And that worked out, I thought, very well, because there were so many sources. And one of the pleasures of this book, I think, is that you get to see the same events from different perspectives. Obviously, a very important perspective is the Mueller team's perspective. But I also, have a lot in there about Trump's legal team. First John Dowd and Jay Sekulow, and later, of course, Rudy Giuliani. That story. So that was what I, how I did the book. And then, of course, it ends, and I was able to include the first month or so of the pandemic, which I think is, while it is not directly related to the other two, I think a lot of what you saw from Donald Trump in the Ukraine and Russia stories, you see in his response to the pandemic.
Did you find that the Mueller team, given the fact that they were locked down from talking and there were essentially no leaks, were they just jumping at the bit to talk with you to get their story out?
Not at all.
Really?
Not at all. I had to beg and plead. One part of journalism that, I love being a journalist. I love having the opportunity to work in television and magazines and write books. But to be honest with you, Jim, one part of the job which I really don't enjoy is trying to get people to talk to me. I love interviewing them once they're talking, but this whole business of courtship of sources and frankly begging is what it amounts to, is not something I particularly enjoy. I was fortunate to speak to several members of Mueller's team, but I certainly would not describe them as anxious or chomping at the bit.
Can we assume, though, that Robert Mueller, who you were not able to interview for this, did he authorize or turn a blind eye to his team and let them know that it was okay to talk with you?
I think that's right. Mueller was, quite fastidious, I think, as most people know, about neither he nor anyone in his office had any contact with the news media during his investigation. But once it was over, once the report was filed, once he closed down its office, then I think he and his staff recognized that it's part of history, and it's worth participating, at least in my version of it.
You know, one of the fun anecdotes in the book was how CNN discovered that Roger Stone might have a problem that morning by carefully seeing who came in and out of the office. Elaborate on that a little bit, because some people said that CNN had an inside source, and it really wasn't that way.
No, it was really a spectacular piece of journalism by my colleagues in the DC bureau of CNN, and it was an act of triangulation of lots of different sources. You know, what my colleagues did there was they monitored the grand jury room. Now, of course, grand jury proceedings are secret, but who walks in and out is not a secret. And if you know the cast of characters well enough, you can identify, at least with some precision, who's being what subject the grand jury is exploring. And my colleagues in the DC bureau knew that there were lots of witnesses related to the Roger Stone case who came in one after another in this period leading up to the denouement. At the same time, they were monitoring the office, the Mueller's office, in the elevators there, of who was going up and down. They saw back at the grand jury that there were several sessions where it was just the lawyers in with the grand jury. Now, if you know anything about federal grand juries, if the grand jury is being asked to issue an indictment, the lawyers alone, without witnesses, go in there and explain the law and talk about the evidence to the grand jury and ask the grand jurors to vote. So the CNN journalists thought, well, you know, it's just the lawyers. They must be moving to an indictment of Roger Stone. At the same time, they saw one day that one of the prosecutors they knew to be involved with the Roger Stone case, wheeling a suitcase out of the office in DC. So they thought, well, it looks like he's going somewhere, and maybe he's going to Florida. Maybe he's going to supervise the arrest of Roger Stone. So they arranged for a crew to be at Roger Stone's house at dawn the following morning, and lo and behold, shortly after the crew showed up, they saw, you know, a bunch of vans with guys in FBI jackets coming to bang on the door and arrest Roger Stone, and we got this fabulous video of the arrest. But there was no collusion, to coin a phrase, between Mueller and CNN. It was just really good journalism and deduction by my colleagues. And I hasten to add, I had nothing to do with it.
One of our viewers, Paula, asks, are we just going to talk about process, or do you want to discuss content? Yes, Paula, we're going to discuss content. And let me also say that I'm seeing for the first time, and maybe it's the subject we're discussing, some inappropriate language, and we're trying to delete that as quickly as possible. We apologize for that.
Did I say something?
Absolutely not, but something is popping up from a few of our, no, it's definitely not from you.
Oh, okay.
I think
gosh.
It shows the time we're living in, and we have some trolls.
I apologize.
No.
I'm ready to apologize because I have been known to use inappropriate language.
No, it's definitely did not come from you. You did not use this language, I promise you.
Okay.
What was the first act that motivated the FBI to open up an investigation?
Well, this is a highly controversial subject, and the subject of an investigation that William Barr ordered and presumably will come out before the election. Based on everything I know, I'll tell you exactly what the beginning of the FBI investigation was. It was in the summer of 2016. It was right after the WikiLeaks released the hacked DNC emails on the eve of the Democratic National Convention. That was a very serious breach and a big piece of news, and very damaging to Hillary Clinton, because those emails revealed that people in the Democratic leadership appeared to be leaning on the scale in favor of Hillary Clinton against Bernie Sanders. Right around that time, when that hack was revealed, an Australian diplomat named Alexander Downer came forward and through channels went to the FBI and said, I didn't think much of this, but at the time, but in the spring of 2016, I had a conversation with this guy, George Papadopoulos, who portrayed himself correctly as a member of the Trump campaign staff, a foreign policy advisor, and he told me that the Russians were going to hack the DNC, and lo and behold, now it's happened. And so it was a result of Papadopoulos's approaching the Alexander Downer, this Australian diplomat, telling the FBI, you may have a problem here because somebody had advance notice. It appears. That's what started the investigation. That's what I have always heard started the investigation. Now, some of the controversy that has arisen involves the famous / infamous Steele dossier, which was a report commissioned by a group from the Clinton campaign about the ties between Russia and the Trump campaign. Christopher Steele is a former British secret intelligence operative.
But who did he work for?
Well, see, again,
that's where it gets confusing, and much more complicated than I mean.
As my dad liked to say, to make a long story unbearable, this is what happened. During the Republican primaries, a group of Republicans who were never Trumpers hired this investigative agency called GPS Fusion to do research on Donald Trump, to go back into his history and see if there was something that would disqualify him. These were Republican operatives who hired GPS Fusion. When it became clear that Trump was going to be the Republican nominee, this group dropped out. The folks at GPS Fusion, who are led by a pair of former Wall Street Journal reporters, they said, well, what are we going to do with all this? Maybe we can sell our expertise in Trump to the Democrats. And they went to Perkins Coie, which was a law firm that represented the Clinton campaign, the Democratic Party, and said, do you want us to continue our work for you? And they said, yes. They said, yes, continue doing your work. It was at that point that GPS Fusion hired Christopher Steele to do this research. But he came up with this dossier of some accurate, some inaccurate, some salacious information about Donald Trump in the fall of 2016. During that period, Steele shopped that around to a bunch of journalists and said, look what I found. But no journalist actually published anything about it leading up to the campaign, leading up to the election, because they felt they couldn't verify anything from it. After Trump wins the election, the first BuzzFeed revealed it. But the important point is that, one of the things that Mueller's critics and the FBI's critics have said was that somehow the Steele dossier was the origin of the FBI investigation and the Mueller investigation, and it just clearly was not. I mean, that's just not, the chronology didn't work that way.
Now, one of our viewers, Gary, asks, did the Clintons pay money? Does the author address Clinton's paying $12 million for the Steele dossier?
No, they didn't pay anywhere near that amount of money.
What did they pay?
I don't remember what the exact, I mean, that's crazy. I mean, it couldn't possibly be that much money.
So take a minute. And describe, in your view, really how Mueller, in a sense, was held hostage by his own concept of what his job was, being special counsel versus being an independent counsel, which Ken Starr was.
Right. This is an important difference that I don't think a lot of people realize. Is there used to be a law called the Ethics in Government Act that had a provision that said there can be independent counsels appointed by a 3-judge panel who operated really independent of the Department of Justice. And Lawrence Walsh, who I worked for, was an independent counsel. Kenneth Starr was an independent counsel. And they really had nothing to do with the Department of Justice. That law, there were a lot of problems with that law. Congress, I think, with bipartisan agreement, let the law expire. So there's no such thing as independent counsels anymore. But there is a provision for a special counsel. And in that circumstance, you have the Department of Justice appointing, in essence, a subordinate, someone who works for the Department of Justice, but operates independently. Mueller was a special counsel. He was appointed by Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, who was in charge of this matter because Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, recused himself because he had been involved in the campaign. And so it's, Robert Mueller was and is an institutionalist. He is someone who has devoted his career to being part of teams, whether it's the Marine Corps or the FBI or the Department of Justice. And he took seriously the idea that he was a subordinate of the Department of Justice. And he was given a mandate, but he didn't want to expand that mandate, in part because he didn't think it was proper, but also because, he also didn't want to take forever, 5 years, the way Starr did. So he had a narrow conception of his mandate. And he also didn't want to pick fights with the president. And that led, I think, to 2 of his biggest mistakes as special counsel, which is failing to subpoena the president, but also failing to issue a report that was spelled out clearly that the president obstructed justice.
So the mandate is from your book. Was it this limited? Links to or between the campaign and Russian government and individuals?
And any cases arising out of that investigation. There were 2 parts, and both parts are important. But you read correctly, that was the mandate. But that mandate did not include Donald Trump's finances, his tax returns. Now, it is possible Mueller could have gone back to Rosenstein and said, can I do this additional investigation? But he didn't do that, and I think I understand why. I think that wouldn't have been the right thing to do.
So what type of communication was there between, say, the Southern District of New York, where you saw some of these cases pop up?
Mueller turned over jurisdiction in several of these cases. Michael Cohen, the investigation of Donald Trump's personal attorney, went to the Southern District because Mueller felt that was not within his original jurisdiction. Again, I don't think every prosecutor would have made that same judgment. But I think that shows how Mueller was not trying to, bring down Donald Trump. He was trying to do his limited mandate, and he felt Cohen was not within that jurisdiction. Now, the Southern District prosecutors were also aware of something that got a lot of attention during this period. The Department of Justice policy that said sitting presidents will never be indicted by the Department of Justice, that is against Department of Justice policy. I happen to think that policy is correct. I don't think there is any way under our constitutional system that a sitting president of the United States can also be a criminal defendant. However, and for that reason, the Southern District investigated Michael Cohen, but they didn't investigate Donald Trump. They too did not go after Trump's tax returns or his financial records because they knew even if they found something, they couldn't indict him.
Do you think, and David asked this, do you ever think we will see Trump's tax returns? Will the New York State attorney who has them, will they ever be released?
Well, I do think that the Manhattan District Attorney, Cyrus Vance, who won his case in the Supreme Court at the end of last term, he will get to see them. There is some post-Supreme Court skirmishing going on, but I have no doubt that Vance is going to win that case, and he will see them. He will see them for a secret grand jury proceeding, which means they will not be publicly disclosed as a matter of course. Now, it is possible, if Vance finds a prosecutable case, he will bring it to trial, and some of those documents will be released in the course of the trial because trials are public. But if that happens, and I have no idea whether it'll happen, it'll be long after the election of 2016. And so, to answer the question a lot of people are curious about, will the public see Trump's tax returns or his financial records before the 2016 election? The answer to that is clearly no.
I want to talk about Rudy Giuliani and his role, because that's you really show him as a hero at one point and then not so at another stage. But before we do that, Chuck Eisman asks, what's your best estimate of the result of the Durham investigation? Will anyone be charged?
I just don't know. What's clear is that his jurisdiction does include possible criminal offenses, but John Durham is a respected U.S. attorney. There have been no leaks coming out of that investigation. It's not even clear to me that he's impaneled a grand jury, which you would need for a criminal case. There certainly will be some sort of written report, and Attorney General Barr all but said that the report will be made public before the election. And but whether there are criminal charges or not, I honest to goodness just have no idea.
Well, let's talk about Rudy Giuliani, because you really give him, in my view, I was surprised by the credit he got for how he assisted President Trump at one point, and particularly about not being subpoenaed.
Maybe it's because I'm a New Yorker and he was the mayor in New York for so long. I just loved writing about Rudy Giuliani because he's such a colorful and at times really bizarre character. I was fortunate to write a profile of him during the middle of all this, so I had a lot of access to him. That's right. I think he did an effective job on the Mueller investigation. I think, as you say, he stretched out the negotiations over the subpoena to such a point that Mueller felt he was out of time and he had to settle for this really inferior form of investigation, which was written questions and answers just about the campaign, which were basically written by two of the other Trump lawyers, Jane and Marty Raskin from Miami, and they were designed to provide as little information as possible. In addition, and this is a more controversial matter, but I think Giuliani's sometimes bizarre and excessive television appearances did serve the purpose of turning Robert Mueller into a political figure and basically tarnishing him as sort of just another Democrat who hired just a bunch of angry Democrats who were anxious to get Trump. And I don't think that's a fair characterization, but what you saw is, when Mueller was appointed, he was really universally praised as someone who was fair, but Giuliani's attacks really turned him into a figure of the political moment, and that really damaged Mueller, and that damaged his public standing. I think it damaged his leverage over witnesses, and so I think that was effective. So that's the Russia side of the story.
Before you go to Ukraine, though, before you go to Ukraine, President Trump had indicated several times, yeah, it's fine, I'd like to be deposed. And they had already scheduled a meeting at Camp David in January, but then that was canceled. Who advised the president not to sit down for that deposition? Or
Well,
was that
ultimately, it was John Dowd at the time. Jay Sekulow felt the same way. And look, anyone who knows Donald Trump's relationship with the truth knew that it was a terrible idea to let him speak under oath to Mueller's investigators. You know, that it would have been a suicide mission, and that's why the business of delaying the interview into oblivion was such an important service that these lawyers provided. It was Dowd who pulled the trigger on who pulled the plug on the January 2016 the January 2018 interview, and it was Giuliani who took over in the spring of 2018, who strung it out over the rest of the year.
Let's jump into Giuliani and Ukraine, because that's a different story.
It's an entirely different story, and I think what you saw in both Giuliani and Trump was hubris, because he got away with the Russia investigation. I mean, he saw that Mueller, did not succeed in pinning criminal activity on him or starting an impeachment proceeding. But instead of leaving well enough alone, Giuliani started this mad project with these two really marginal figures, Lev Parnas and his friend Igor, and they, started coercing the government of Ukraine, an American ally, to investigate the Bidens, because the president thought correctly that Biden was a very important rival of his in the 2020 election. And Giuliani's ham-handed, clumsy, arguably improper, if not illegal, actions in Ukraine set the stage for the impeachment of the president. I mean, he got his client impeached, which is not something I think any lawyer in history could say, or certainly would want to say. Now, Trump, of course, did this to himself, but he only did it because Giuliani gave him the opportunity and the vehicle to do it.
I'm seeing a number of questions about CrowdStrike in Ukraine. Sort of to tell us how that story has been sort of promoted by the Sean Hannity and others.
I mean, it's just amazing to me that this story lives on. I mean, it has been discredited so many different ways, but after the DNC was hacked, they hired this American company called CrowdStrike to do a forensic examination of their computers to figure out what the hell happened, why were we hacked, what went on here. Somehow the story came out, through right-wing media, that CrowdStrike was a Ukrainian company, that CrowdStrike shipped those servers back to Ukraine, and that Ukraine was somehow involved in the hacking, not Russia. None of that is true. It's been disproven any number of times. But the president, including when he was standing side by side in Helsinki with Vladimir Putin, raised the issue of CrowdStrike. But I mean, it did not. I mean, nothing happened with CrowdStrike related to the hacking. This was all part of this conspiracy theory to prove that Ukraine actually did the hacking as opposed to Russia. But you need only read the Mueller report or read the report of the intelligence agencies, which showed in detail just exactly how the hacking was done. It was done by Russian military intelligence. It was an extraordinary piece of investigating, largely by Mueller, where he showed day by day how the hacking took place. But this CrowdStrike story has stayed out there for reasons that, remain mysterious to me.
And staying on Ukraine, and I know you covered this in quite a bit of detail in the book, Gary says, regarding Ukraine, does the author address Biden's withholding $1 billion unless the prosecutor who was investigating his son, Hunter, for illegal dealings was fired?
No. I mean, there was an international policy that that this prosecutor under the president before Zelensky was corrupt. Everyone wanted to get rid of him. The European Union, the United Nations, the American government. And Biden went to Ukraine and said, we want to get rid of him, and you're not going to get our aid unless you get rid of him. This was a policy, it was an open policy. It wasn't like some secret deal. It had nothing to do with his son. His son wasn't even under investigation at that point. So the notion that this was some sort of deal to protect Hunter Biden is just simply not true.
Let's talk a little bit about how the Mueller report was released, because in a sense, that's another area where the Mueller team was outplayed really by Attorney General Barr.
In very dramatic fashion. And this is a story I tell in the book. As I say, Mueller kind of tied himself in knots not to reach a conclusion about whether the president committed obstruction of justice. He felt like he couldn't offer a definitive word. And so he came up with this very confusing, I'm not exonerating him, but I'm not convicting him. I'm not saying he did. I'm not saying he didn't. And he turned that over to...
Yeah, if I could just read that sentence.
Sure,
it's on page 302. Based on the facts and the applicable legal standards, we are unable to reach that judgment. Accordingly, while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. And then you go on and try to explain that convoluted language.
Well, I try to explain that convoluted language, and I'm not sure I succeeded, but it was a mistake not to come out and just say what the evidence showed, but by leaving this ambiguous and letting Barr make the announcement by himself, he let Barr sabotage the report. He let Barr say, based on my cursory review, I think there were no crimes found here. I don't think that's justified by the facts. I don't think that's what the report shows. But Mueller, the institutionalist that he is, trusted that that Barr would deal with him in a straightforward fashion, and I think he didn't realize what a partisan Barr had become.
Because Barr gave him a chance to review the letter.
Barr gave him a chance to review the letter, and this is a key moment, and I think it's so interesting how people think. And what happened was, one of Barr's deputies went to Aaron Zebley, who was effectively the second in command of Mueller, and said, "Would you like to review the letter first?" And Zebley went to Mueller, and they had a conference about this. This was the day that the letter was released, and they concluded, well, look, I don't want to vouch for Barr's letter. I don't want Barr to say we approve this letter. So we're not even going to read the letter. We're not going to express an opinion one way or another. It's somewhat of an understandable view. But what happened was they lost the chance to say, this is wrong. This is not fair. This is not an accurate characterization of our report. And so their decision not to answer, not to review the letter, I think redounded poorly on them. Plus, what they didn't know is that Barr was not going to release anything for a month after that, his press conference where he released his letter. So all anybody knew about the Mueller report from the day of Mueller, the day of Mueller's Barr's press conference, was what Barr said about it, his minimizing it and frankly misleading people about it. That was the conventional wisdom about the report hardened over that following month, and the fact that the report wasn't out there basically led people to say, the president most of all, saying, oh, there was nothing here, this whole thing was a waste of time, when in fact, if you read the report, as I think not that many people did, you can see that there was actually a lot there.
As you said, the Washington Post had a bestseller, but probably not very many people read it.
Yes, I don't know how many people remember the Stephen Hawking book, A Brief History of Time, about black holes and whatnot, which sold an enormous number of copies, and including one to me, and I couldn't make heads or tails out of it, and I didn't finish reading it. I think it was sort of a similar phenomenon with the Mueller report. A lot of people bought it, but I don't know how many people made it through its 400 single-space pages.
You know, when you get to another one of the president's attorneys, and I just didn't know anything about him, although I thought he looked like a very effective attorney, and that's Jay Sekulow. I didn't know about his earlier background. Why don't you tell us?
I just, this is why I love writing books, is because you get to write about people like Jay Sekulow. And also, I hate to sound like Father Time here, but when you cover law as I have for, now several decades, a lot of the same people turn up again and again. And in my first book about the Supreme Court, The Nine, I have a whole chapter about Jay Sekulow, because Jay Sekulow, he grew up in a Jewish family on Long Island, but when he moved to Atlanta, he became an evangelical Christian, and he started representing this group called Jews for Jesus, which he belonged to, which is a Christian group. And he started litigating cases which really revolutionized free speech law on behalf of religious organizations. He was a very successful Supreme Court advocate. He also became a leader in the conservative movement and wound up being hired by Trump as sort of the constitutional lawyer in the Mueller investigation. He wound up doing a lot more than just constitutional law, because the president fired John Dowd. It was really up to, Sekulow was practically the only lawyer there for a while, but it was he's just a great character and a very good lawyer. And he was the one from the very beginning saying, don't let Donald Trump talk to investigators, and his view ultimately prevailed.
So in the book, you also talk a lot about how the President Trump and his advisors really have used, I guess more President Trump, the power of the pardon. And John McClure says, is there any chance that Stone, who's had his sentence commuted, will be resent to jail for his crimes? So respond to John's question about Stone, and how has the president used his power of pardoning people?
Well, let me just answer the easy part. There's no chance that Roger Stone is going to prison. His sentence was, he was sentenced to prison, but his sentence was commuted. He wasn't pardoned. So when you're pardoned, like Patty Hearst was pardoned, you are no longer a convicted felon. It's like the case never happened. A commutation is somewhat different. It means that the sentence is invalidated, including the fine, but the conviction still stands. It's to a certain extent a semantic difference, but it is a difference. But what's clear is that Roger Stone is not going to prison. In terms of the power of the pardon, this is one of the most unreviewable and significant powers any president has, because the president doesn't have to check with anybody, doesn't have to review it with anybody, and he can simply do it. And a lot of presidents have done it in controversial ways. George Herbert Walker Bush pardoned all the Iran-Contra people as he was leaving the White House. Bill Clinton pardoned Mark Rich, the fugitive financier, as well as his brother. And Donald Trump has used the power of the pardon to reward his political allies, whether it was Joe Arpaio, the sheriff out in Phoenix, whether it was Dinesh D'Souza, the conservative activist.
he has used the power to reward his allies. And I think what was particularly significant about his use of the pardon and his threat to use of the pardon was that it led several people involved in the whole Russia investigation, like Michael Flynn, like Roger Stone, like Paul Manafort, never to cooperate really with the Mueller investigation, never to do what people in white-collar investigations usually do, which is flip, plead guilty and agree to cooperate in hopes of getting a lower sentence, because I think they recognized correctly that they were all going to wind up getting pardoned anyway.
And as you write, because they had lied so often in different parts during the process, then their testimony really didn't have any credibility and couldn't be used.
That's certainly true. That's true. I mean, the whole basis of the Michael Flynn guilty plea was that he lied to the FBI, and Roger Stone was also convicted of lying to congressional committees, and Paul Manafort was convicted of all manner of things. He hasn't been pardoned or had his sentence commuted either, but he's out of prison because of COVID worries.
We have a question about Nancy Pelosi. How do you think she'll go down, how she handled this in history?
The interesting thing about Nancy Pelosi is that, she is correctly seen as a very liberal member of Congress from San Francisco. But she is someone who is very concerned, above all, with preserving her Democratic majority in the House of Representatives. And she was very skeptical about impeachment, almost up to the last minute, because she took the lesson from 1998 when the Republican House of Representatives pushed forward on the Clinton impeachment, even though it was clear he was never going to be convicted in the Senate. And she said, I'm not going to expose particularly those members of my House, conference to the political risk of voting for an impeachment that's never going to go anywhere anyway. And she was against impeachment throughout the Mueller investigation, even after Robert Mueller filed his report. And I think one of the most interesting parts of my book is what flipped Nancy Pelosi. What flipped her was one thing in particular. There were 5 members, freshman members of the House of Representatives, all of whom were elected in Trump districts in 2018, led by a woman named Abigail Spangbendler from Virginia, former CIA agent who was elected in a very purple district. And after the Ukraine allegations came out, the 5 of them got together, and it was really kind of moving because I think they really felt the weight of history on them. And they said, look, we took oaths to uphold the Constitution, and this is wrong what the president did. This is just wrong. And they collaborated on an op-ed piece in the Washington Post that said, we now think that an impeachment investigation is appropriate. And the next day, Nancy Pelosi held a press conference and said, the House is going to conduct an impeachment inquiry. And it shows that, Pelosi is a highly skilled political operative. And she was only willing to go forward when her vulnerable members said, it's okay, we think this is a matter of principle, we think this investigation should go forward.
So a few quick questions. We only have about 4 minutes left. Gary wants to know, do you address George Soros's funding Fusion GPS and Christopher Steele's dossier?
The answer is I do not address it because it didn't happen. George Soros had nothing to do with it. The Fusion GPS was funded by first this Republican group, these never Trumpers, and then they were founded by the Democrats. I mean, by Hillary Clinton's campaign. George Soros had nothing to do with it.
Jeff, there have been so many questions that are taking this sort of very far right movement, and of course, you've written your book on the research that you've done. Why do you think there is, right? I mean, this clearly is why we have such partisanship. How are we going to break through this in our country?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with the fracturing of the news media. You know, in 1974, when Richard Nixon was forced out of office, you know, you had the three major networks. You had a law called the Fairness Doctrine that said they had to present balanced sides. And you know, people had theories about Walter Cronkite's real political views, but I think it's safe to say, you know, that he was a pretty straight down the middle guy. Same with Huntley Brinkley on NBC. You know, what happened with the rise of cable, led by Rupert Murdoch, and Rupert Murdoch saw there was a tremendous business opportunity there, that there could be a conservative network. And thus the birth of Fox News, which was a brilliant business idea. You also have now, and that was really, I think, you know, the evident in the Clinton impeachment. When you layer onto that the internet, and especially Facebook, which I think is in many respects more important than cable news, where everybody, you know, millions and millions of people, far more than the number of people who watch cable news, get their news from Facebook. And the Facebook algorithm shows you what you want to see. So, you know, if you're a conservative, you'll see Breitbart and Fox News. And if you're a liberal, you'll see, you know, MSNBC and The Nation. We don't have a common set of facts anymore. And under the First Amendment, what are we going to, you know, nobody's going to tell Fox News to shut down. Nobody's going to tell MSNBC to fire Rachel Maddow. I mean, these people, quite appropriately, are exercising their First Amendment rights, but they are contributing to this extreme polarization, and I don't see it ending anytime soon.
Well, that's a good segue to ask you to talk about the dedication in your book.
The dedication in my book is to my fellow journalists. And there are really sort of two reasons for that. One is that this has been a terrible time for the much of the journalism world for business reasons. I mean, the internet has all but destroyed many newspapers in the country. You know, here we are in Dallas. You know, the Dallas Morning News, the Star Telegram in Fort Worth. I mean, these used to be enormous newspapers, tremendously influential in their communities. And, you know, the apps, the circulation has plunged, and even more significantly, advertising has plunged, and they have become really marginal businesses. And I just wanted to, I don't really have a solution to that, but it's just been a scary time. From a business perspective. But the other
and the virus hasn't helped either.
Sorry?
The virus hasn't helped either.
Well, I mean, yes, that's true, but the decline of newspapers long predates.
I'm happy that someone asked this question. Are you planning to do
the other reason I added, I just, you know, the president's words, fake news, enemies of the people, I don't think it's true. I don't think it's right. I'm proud to be a journalist. I think journalists are indispensable to the flourishing of our democracy, and that's the other reason why I dedicated the book to my fellow journalists.
So I'm glad someone else asked this question. Are you planning to write a sequel to The Nine?
Well, I did sort of write a sequel to The Nine.
Oh, but are you planning to do it with another one?
Another one, you know, I sure there are writers out there who, when they finish a big project, they think, boy, I can't wait to get started on another ordeal. I am not one of them. I find these books totally emotionally and physically exhausting.
You're not Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Yeah, you know, well, but you know, you look at Doris's work, whom I admire a great deal. They are spaced out by several years.
She spends a decade with each president that she writes about.
Yeah, and David McCullough, and you know, these are, you know, people I admire a great deal.
I want to thank you for spending an hour with us. And for those of you whose questions I did not read, When we have Sarah Sanders in a few weeks, maybe I'll read them then. Keep on watching and listening to our program. And Jeff, congratulations on your book, and continued good health to you and your family.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to all the people who watched.
And remember, you can purchase a copy of Jeff's book now at interrobangbooks.com, 10% off. Just type in DFW World. Thanks again for watching.